Welcome to Eleanor's World, my fellow and lovely members of the Lumos Lounge, your destination for magical stories and unforgettable journeys. Don't forget to comment the video. And for all of you that aren't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. Thank you for joining and helping to keep the magic alive. And now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Welcome back, Lumos Lounge, to a new story on my channel. Bound and determined by fate's mistakes, you can find the story on Archive of Our Own. The link is in the description down below. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the magic. Summary. After Ron and Hermione botch a ritual in an attempt to stop Harry abandoning them to live his own life, Harry is left trapped within the boundaries of Hogwarts in his 7th year, with the other students blaming him for the bad decisions of his peers in retaliation for seeking retribution. The staff of Hogwarts take up the role of his new family, whether he likes it or not. Strangely enough, it's the resident potions master who has the biggest impact on him. He just doesn't realize how big of an impact until it's almost too late. Chapter 1. Bound Home. Are you sure we should be doing this, Ron? You heard what he said, Hermione. He's talking about leaving everything behind for who knows how long. He won't even tell us why. Why the hell can't he find himself with us? We're supposed to be his best friends, and he just wants to leave us behind too. I won't let him do that. But what if something goes wrong? That's why you're here. This ritual is supposed to tie him to us, and you already said he couldn't survive without us, so this is for his own good. Technically, I said he would probably get himself into more trouble than he could handle without us there. Same thing. Are you going to help or not? Well, of course. You're right. This is for his own good. But what if he finds out? That's the best part. The ritual makes him feel attached to us, compels him to keep us nearby, but he won't be able to figure out the difference in his own mind. He'll just wake up and realize he's an idiot, trying to go off to places unknown without his 2 best friends at his side? All right, Ron. I just hope this doesn't blow up in our faces. What could go wrong? 7th year. They'd made it. Voldemort gone to a place he couldn't come back from. But for what? Harry sighed as he walked towards Hogsmeade, slightly behind Ron and Hermione, the day after his first normal Halloween. They'd been acting very oddly the past few days. He knew they were upset with him, ever since he'd told them he planned to quit school come Christmas, strike out on his own, find himself, figure out what the hell he was supposed to do with his life now, without a monster to vanquish and people to protect. Who was just Harry? What was his purpose in life? Where did he belong? Questions he had no answers to, but it seemed very important to him that he find the answer. He felt so lost in a world he had no place in, and he had to do it alone. That was the big thing. You couldn't define yourself if you were with people who'd long since already decided who you were. Ron and Hermione had been angry, but he'd hoped that giving them until Christmas to process the news of his departure would make things go smoother. They still seemed very angry that he wasn't taking them with him on his next great adventure, but over the last few days they'd been watching him like a hawk, like they were waiting for something. They'd asked a dozen or more times if he was really sure he wanted to go alone. With every yes, they'd gotten a little weirder. In the past day, they'd devolved into not talking to him at all, whispering behind their hands to each other, and otherwise treating him like a bug under a microscope. Harry grunted as he ran into something solid but semi-pliable. He looked up to apologize to whomever he'd hit, only to see nothing. Ron and Hermione were still walking ahead of him, whispering and glancing back every few seconds. He tried again to move forward, but again hit an invisible barrier. He put up his hands. Nothing there, except his hands would not pass beyond the gates. He looked around at the other students shuffling past him in the brisk fall air, passing beyond Hogwarts gates without so much as a stumble or pause. He pressed against the shield, moving side to side along the gates. No way through. Confused and a little frightened, Harry looked to his friends. Ron and Hermione had stopped about 10 feet from him and were looking on with panicked, frightened gazes. They glanced at each other, and guilt joined the party of emotions that backlit their eyes and creased their brows. Overwhelming anger overtook Harry's confusion as he realized they had done something stupid, something that had trapped him at Hogwarts. "No, no! What did you do?" he demanded. He beat his hand against the invisible barrier. "What did you do? What did you do?" His hands beat against the barrier as his friends backed away a few steps, as if afraid his anger alone would break whatever curse they had placed on him. He continued to scream the same 4 words over and over, his hands beating against the barrier until they bled, the blood flowing down the shield in droplets that touched the grass. It was a wall, a bloody, unforgiving wall, between him and his freedom. Hot, angry tears streamed down his cheeks. Students stopped to stare at the trapped and betrayed boy who lived. Eventually, someone went and retrieved McGonagall from her post at the school doors, still checking permission slips of 3rd years. "Let me get this straight," McGonagall cried indignantly, pacing in front of Ron and Hermione, who were standing at the end of Harry's bed in the hospital wing. Harry watched, glowering furiously, while Madame Pomfrey finished healing his hand. He'd bruised them pretty deeply, as well as his shoulder and foot, dislocating a couple of knuckles and breaking the skin along the entire pinky side of both hands. The lacerations and blood only required a spell. Dislocated knuckles, too. The bruises would last a while, even with the salve she was using. Some of them were bone deep. He'd beat on that stupid barrier for so long. "You two went behind my back, used my hard-won permission for the restricted section, at which time you should have been doing the theory work for the long, arduous process of becoming an animagus, which you blatantly lied about, and instead looked up a forbidden ritual that predated Merlin, and then proceeded to use this dark ritual in an effort to take away Mr. Potter's right to free will,"
the Transfiguration professor demanded.
"But, Professor, he was going to—" "I know very well what Mr. Potter intended to do." McGonagall overrode Hermione. "We had a long discussion about it, and he had every right to make that decision on his own, and you, as his best friends, should have encouraged him. Instead, you betrayed his trust, broke at least 6 school statutes and 3 laws. You will both be expelled. You should count yourselves lucky that Potter has refused to press criminal charges for your foolish, selfish actions." Ron and Hermione winced, glancing back at Harry, Hermione's face ruddy and tear-stained. Harry sneered back with a curled lip. He hadn't done it for them. He was so angry. Criminal charges were the least of what he wanted done to them. But criminal charges would mean a trial, and having to tell everyone that he was a man lost in not 1 world, but 2. Criminal charges would mean publicly announcing that he was a weak, useless old soldier at the age of 17. It meant admitting that he'd prayed for death when Snape, of all people, had saved him and Dumbledore the year before in that stupid cave. They'd been ridiculously lucky that, behind Dumbledore's back, Snape had acquired his own small network of spies that had located and destroyed the Horcruxes well before Dumbledore had finally introduced Harry to their idea and his final test of battle. If the Potions Master hadn't shown up shortly after Voldemort had found them and that First Avada had killed the broken part of himself living in his teen foe, the Gryffindor doubted he'd have been able to finish his God-given purpose. No matter what Lily had said at the train station of Lost Souls, "You two will go immediately to your dorms and pack. You will then join myself and the rest of your professors in the headmaster's office, where we will try to undo your crass, despicable action. Failing that, Merlin forbid, you may find yourselves in a world more trouble once the board hears of your deplorable behavior." "Yes, Professor," Hermione murmured meekly.
Ron nodded heavily, and they both slunk out of the hospital wing.
McGonagall moved in Harry's direction just as Pomfrey finished applying the salve to his other hand. "Mr. Potter, I am not normally someone who defends capital punishment, but I'll reiterate my earlier recommendation that you reconsider pressing charges," McGonagall said sternly. "The actions of your so-called friends were quite criminal, and someone in your unique position should set the example. They should not be allowed to get off so easily, in my opinion." "I'll consider it, Professor," Harry agreed reluctantly. And he would because she was right. He hadn't chosen to be a goddamn hero, but he was one, and he really did have an example to set, friends or not. If he let them get away with something as unspeakable as this, what else might others think they could get away with? Ron and Hermione had been in the papers as much as he had since Voldemort's defeat. If they didn't have to bow to the law, it could wreak havoc on the justice system Harry had once hoped to serve. Come, I'll take you to the headmaster's office. We'll see what can be done about this newest challenge in your life. Harry nodded and stood. He started to follow behind his head of house, but stopped and looked back at the hospital matron, who'd been standing awkwardly off to the side. There was deep sorrow in her eyes, and he moved back to her unthinkingly. He leaned forward to kiss away the single tear on her cheek. "Thank you," he told the witch sincerely, taking her hand in his. "Barring miracles, you may be tending my wounds for the rest of my life as I wander these halls. Thank you, Madame Pomfrey, for always being here when I need you." Pomfrey breathed deeply through her nose. "Away with you, Mr. Potter," she said sternly. Harry smiled at the softness in her eyes. She allowed herself her own small smile as he turned to join McGonagall, who was waiting by the door. Harry followed his head of house closely as she led the way to the 7th floor and frowned in thought. A part of him was still considering what she had said about charges, but at the fore of his mind was the thought of Pomfrey and the entire staff of Hogwarts. They'd all played their roles in his life admirably. Being trapped with them now, as the shock of what Ron and Hermione had done was wearing off, he felt a bit like a heel. They'd done their best to keep him alive, and mostly succeeded. He realized, as he went to beg and hope for their help once more, that he'd failed to give any of them their due. He wasn't just another student to be taught and set free. He was Harry, goddamn Potter, and who knew what they'd all sacrificed just to keep him alive one more year, and one more year after that. He still wanted to leave, to go and figure out who he was, and what more the world could expect from him, now more than ever, but he realized sourly that he'd never given his teachers a second thought before now. He'd only thanked Madame Pomfrey on a whim, likely induced by the calming draught and pain potions she'd given him, but he knew now that he'd done it, that he owed all of them that, and a hell of a lot more. Even Snape, though Harry doubted he'd ever be able to grind out so much as a thank you to the sadistic prick. The potions master was a bully and an arse, but he was an arse who'd saved his life a dozen times. McGonagall gave the password to the gargoyle, turtle truffles, and Harry followed on the steps up to the headmaster's domain, head still bent in thought. After his brief enlightenment about his teachers, and the knowledge that he had no idea how to go about repaying his great debt to them all, he was now gnawing away at the generous bone his head of house had given him. "Do you want to press charges?"
He should, he knew that, but they were his friends, or at least they had been.
And if what they had done could be reversed, then surely expulsion was enough. As they finally entered Dumbledore's office, where most of the rest of Hogwarts' powerful teachers were already gathered and waiting, Harry found he'd already discovered his decision amongst his churning thoughts. If what they'd done was reversible, he could let them slide with the relatively minor punishment of expulsion. If, however, it could not, then he had no choice but to press charges, for the same reasons that made him not want to. If he didn't, it could be viewed as a weakness greater than being a failed martyr, and there were too many young witches and wizards with their eyes turned to him. Probably the justice system of Wizarding Britain could survive, but what about the younger generations? What might they put up with from supposed friends? Because he had allowed his own to curse him without repercussion. He was all too aware of what he'd put up with himself from those who'd pretended to befriend him on Dudley's orders. Ron and Hermione joined them with Snape, the last to arrive. Even the way he and Harry felt about each other, Harry was a little glad that Snape seemed just as angry at the two conniving Gryffindors as the other professors. It meant this really was as weighty and awful as he thought it was. Snape went immediately to a dimly lit corner by the fire, and Harry waited at the other side of the room beside his head of house as Ron and Hermione came to a stop at the center of the room. Their heads were bent in shame, and they refused to so much as glance around at him or any of the professors. "I hope you understand," Dumbledore began coldly, "the horrible implications of what you've done." Ron and Hermione remained silent, heads down. "You used dark magic. Magic is not a toy to be played with. You have done irreparable harm to your very souls with your selfishness. No matter whether what you've done is irreversible, you've damned yourselves." Harry glowered sourly at the headmaster. Leave it to the crazy old bastard to think, not of his golden boy's pain and suffering, but of the poor, lost souls that had done this to him. God only knew, the old coot might even have wanted a similar outcome, just to keep him close to home should duty call once more. Giving a quick glance around to be sure no one had caught his momentary visible disdain for their fearless leader, Harry realized that nearly all of the teachers looked just as angry. Snape was watching him with an unfathomable gaze, and McGonagall was solely focused on glaring angrily at her wayward student. Harry supposed that by now they were both well acquainted with Dumbledore's eccentric view of right and wrong. As I'm sure your head of house informed you, Dumbledore continued, you will both be expelled. Following our attempt at a countercurse, you may be additionally punished. It is within the board's rights to press lesser charges against you on Mr. Potter's behalf. You're both to wait over there beside Professor Burbage while the majority of us try to undo what you have carelessly wrought upon your peer. Ron and Hermione moved over to the Muggle Studies professor, who held their shoulders in her death grip. Harry watched with a small amount of pleasure as her fingers sunk angrily into them like claws, and Ron visibly gritted his teeth in pain. It was the least of what they deserved. A glance to their right showed that the only one who'd noticed his brief lapse of anger into twisted, sadistic pleasure was, again, Snape. The man was eyeing him carefully before his hard scowl returned, and he stepped forward with the other professors. Harry, if you please, Dumbledore invited, gesturing to the center of the room. The boy who lived stepped into the place indicated and looked down as his teachers, and several he didn't have, circled him. Beneath him glowed a white rune, and a powerful magic already swirled around him, lightly whipping his clothes and hair. Professor Babbling, the ancient runes professor, passed to each teacher a small sheet of parchment. Harry guessed it was the countercurse, maybe modified because of how badly Ron and Hermione's had gone awry. On Dumbledore's mark, the professors began to cast the long-winded spell together. Harry closed and shielded his eyes as light burst around him, stinging his pupils viciously. He found that, aside from Snape, he couldn't discern the voices of his teachers as their chanting continued. Snape's voice was deep, stark, and melodic. Everyone else, in comparison, sounded brittle and feckless. As slowly as the ritual had begun, it came to a sudden halt as the light that had engulfed Harry exploded outward in a flash and forceful burst of magic that knocked all but a few of the professors off their feet. Harry opened his eyes to see Dumbledore, Firenze, McGonagall, and Snape lowering their arms from their faces, the others in the room sprawled on the floor and dazedly picking themselves up. McGonagall looked horrified. Snape, on Dumbledore's other side, carried a look of damnation. Firenze rounded furiously on the fallen bastards who'd done this, and Dumbledore actually swore. In the deathly silent office, he might as well have shouted it. Harry turned a murderous glare on his fellow Gryffindors, who were being lifted to their feet by Burbage's clawed fingers on their arms. They had the good sense to flinch and lower their gazes back to the tips of their shoes. "I'm sorry, Harry," Dumbledore murmured, confirming that the counter hadn't worked, as if there'd been any doubt. Harry looked at the headmaster and bit his tongue to stop the stubborn urge to tell the man to go screw himself. He was still hell-bent to believe Dumbledore had probably wanted this on some level. He looked instead to McGonagall. "Professor, I think you had better call the Aurors," he said coldly. Ron gaped at him, turning a sickly green, and Hermione burst into tears. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. If you'd like to support the channel, check out my Amazon wishlist or consider making a donation. Every little bit helps to keep the magic alive. See you next time, and until then, take care and keep dreaming.